Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week we are speaking to my good friend and the internet's master of conspiramonies, Greg Carlwood. As you are no doubt aware, Greg is the prolific and thoughtful host of the Higherside Chats. In a thematic follow-up to last week's show on Gnosticism, it seems useful to explore how we map and respond to the known and unknown in our world. Mr. Carlwood, other side of the mic.
Hey, my beer pong buddy, what's happening?
Yeah. We made an okay team. We didn't come last.
Right, which is new for me, with anything involving hand-eye coordination.
Well, it was late. We were all intoxicated. That was, I'd forgotten about that. My first ever beer pong experience, and I didn't come last.
Right. Very American frat boy. So it's nice to kind of scratch that off the list, play in that box for a minute, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I can basically say I'm a professional athlete now, which is, something that's theoretically been on the bucket list.
Of course, you got the merit badge.
So for people who are listening, we are referring to the Carlwood Nuptials San Diego experience in July of this year. And how is the freshly minted Mrs. Carlwood?
Oh, she's great. Yeah. Married life is pretty much the same as non-married life, and you've been together for 7+ years. But it's something that women like. And so, she's happy, I'm happy, right? Happy wife, happy life, they say.
As they do. It was an impressive experience. As I sort of mentioned at the time, I have not been to a wedding where the vows include mentioning multiple currency crises and sigil magic. Right.
And a guy given the ceremony as a Jedi in a Jedi cloak. That's probably fairly unique, especially for a La Jolla wedding.
Yeah, well, yeah, a very THC experience. But speaking of, I know we briefly chatted about the traditional first question, but I have something before that to maybe familiarize yourself with the process, put you at ease, make it feel a bit more like home.
Deal.
All right. That's my dramatic cough. I don't actually have a cough. In these dog days of dying empires, surveillance states, and tweeting tyrants, it gets harder and harder to identify the occulted elite using an elite occultism of secret space programs, manipulated media, demon drugs, and fraudulent finance to keep this rigged system sucking the souls, stem cells, and shekels from the propagandized polity. Out of Missouri and into the Magonian maze of meme magic, mass psychosis, mind control, Mothmen, and mysterious polar anomalies steps a guide for our times. Podcasting psychopomp prowling the underworld tunnels of banker wars, bloodline royalty, and brazen assassinations. Sunny San Diego's scion of stoner Socratics, the man with both the plan and the van, Greg freaking Carlwood. Were you a weird kid?
Wow. Yeah. Call this guy FedEx because you just delivered, man. That was great. It's so easy, Oh,
I spent that's not for me. I spent 2 hours on that, and then I'm like, I'm ready for my Greg interview. And I'm like, no, I should do some questions rather than just write out an introduction.
I love it, man. That was beautiful. But I definitely was a weird kid. I've heard so many of your episodes that it's interesting the way people always answer that first question. Sometimes it's like they just how would I not be a weird kid? And that's kind of true for anyone who's going to be interviewed on a show like this. But weird in the typical sense, one thing that I did that really I reflect on kind of often is when I was very young. I know I was in preschool because of just the timing of it, which is 5 years old? And we lived in an apartment complex because my parents were having a house built. And so we're in this place. And I have one friend who lives across the way. And one day, for whatever reason, I said, hey, man, why don't we go door to door and just say we're collecting money for charity? And he was just blown away by the concept of this. And so we start going around collecting money just with no plan, knocking on random doors. People are inviting us in, and he's nervous to go in strangers' houses. And we're collecting money. We went and bought comic books. And then my parents were like, how the hell did you get these comic books? Where'd they come from? Because we just walked down the street to get them. But I think about that now at 30. And anytime I'm afraid to do something or, there's just an unknown I have to face, I'm like, at 5 years old, you were walking into strangers' houses claiming to collect money for charity and then went and bought comic books. I don't know. It just seems so weird for a kid that young to do. And I also have been getting into Jordan Peterson lately, and he talks a lot about developing your shadow, knowing your capacity to deceive and your capacity for evil so that you can even be a good person as you develop. And I don't know. I just felt like that was kind of an interesting aspect of it. But
yeah, it is. I mean, that demonstrates, because funnily enough, obviously, I ask people this question. It forces them, usually, some of them will say, no, I'm not. And then they get about 10 minutes into their answer and kind of realize, actually, maybe I was. And for me, that looks like the kid who did that sees through the construct. So in some respects, it is inevitable that he ends up a prominent conspiracy podcaster, because at 5, you looked at it going, this is all made up. Mm-hmm. This is literally made up by people, not me.
And there was actually a realization that people aren't going to expect deception to come through the lens of a 5-year-old saying they're collecting charity. Like, I was cognizant of that, which is kind of strange and high level maybe for a little kid. But it was such a juxtaposition with the kid I was with and his whole attitude towards the whole thing that just made me feel like I was different. But in the other sense of the word, in the destined sense of the word, yeah, there were some weird things that happened there too. And we've talked before about the fact that when I was getting into magic through you, and you recommended ancestor altars, and through that I started learning a little bit more about my own family history. And we have a tendency, I think, sometimes to think that our parents' lives start with our birth, and we forget that they've lived entire lives before we came into existence. And both my parents ended up, between the two of them, they lost 3 siblings before I was born, and I only knew a little bit about it, and some I didn't even know about. But in a weird way, they all kind of met their demise through some form of the power pyramid or the system, whether it was getting beaten up by cops trying to close up a bar, developing brain damage and then insomnia, and then killing yourself because you can't sleep, or whether it was getting entrapped by a cop for sodomy and then going basically to a mental institution, being sentenced basically for being gay, and then after years of electroshock therapy, coming out, can't reintegrate into society, so you kill yourself. You know, multiple aunts and uncles of mine, mainly 3 uncles, that I'd never had, were taken out by the system. And it's interesting to learn that after you have a successful conspiracy show, that you're like, man, maybe there is a little bit of destiny here.
It is. Do you think, because I was actually, speaking of San Diego, one of the discussions I had with Alex, maybe a couple of years ago, Alex from Skeptico, was you kind of, particularly with Americans, I think you're not seeing clearly if you don't realize how close the control system is and how pervasive it is to your life. And you kind of go on a conspiracy journey, and then something clicks and you go, oh shit. Like, he had examples of having clients for his business where it was essentially the back end of it was a military contractor, and the people who worked there, who were his clients, couldn't get into the back 2/3 of the actual building because their swipe card wouldn't let them in, and they had no fucking idea what was going on in there. And you just kind of realize how close some kind of occulted system may be to each of your lives, and it potentially says something about its pervasiveness.
Absolutely. And, you know, a lot of this stuff just goes back to the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, yeah, a lot of these things did touch your family in just a few generations back in ways you probably don't know about, and your family doesn't even understand because they aren't into this kind of stuff. But if you do the digging, I think a lot of people will find that connection. But I have you to thank, really, for even putting the attention into those questions that they really deserved. And then, coming out with some answers that I just think really make me feel more comfortable with my path, even more than I already was.
Well, speaking of things you have to thank, I haven't asked you this before, and I don't think anyone else has. Tell us about your first weed experience.
Oh, man. Well, another aspect of me that was weird is I didn't really drink or smoke until I was at least 20, but maybe even 21. Like, in high school, I was not a dude who was drinking at parties. I was just telling jokes and being weird. And the first weed experience, was in college with friends that I was hanging out with, and I finally decided I was going to drink. And so my buddy poured me like 6 shots of Jaeger, and we got the party started. And then after that, he was like, man, if you liked this, I know you would like weed probably a lot better. It seems more your speed. It seems more your style. And, you see all the stereotypical stoner movies, the Cheech and Chongs, the Harold and Kumars, and you're like, sure, it looks like a good time. And yeah, man, it really was everything people described. And I don't know why I was such a straight edge kid necessarily, but I just was so anti all that stuff. And then as soon as the doors open, I mean, they were pretty much blown off from that point. But the first weed experience is probably very stereotypical. I mean, actually, the first one was, again, stereotypical, where you don't feel anything. And then it takes maybe 2 or 3 times to really blast off. And then you're kind of chasing that dragon forever. Now I do it out of habit and almost feel nothing.
Well, that's the same with everything in life, I guess. So I didn't know that. I figured because we should wind the clock back to talking about seeing through the construct, your school experience was also atypical, and I assumed you were actually a stoner kid as well. But in fact, the fact that school wasn't a good fit for you is probably closer to kind of like a personality thing.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I was definitely a punk kid, but I guess I just adopted the straight edge stuff mainly from seeing some adults in my life not handle it all that well, and so thinking that maybe it was a path to destruction. So I was drinking the Dare Kool-Aid those days. And I grew up in a Catholic school. So some aspects of that residue stuck with me. And maybe that's another reason why I was so bitter once I finally did start smoking and did start altering consciousness and seeing real value in it, is I felt extra angry about being lied to and maybe missing some potential years of added use. But at this point, it's probably a good thing because I tend to overindulge anyway. Well,
so now that I've put the timings together, if your first weed experience was 20, and it only took a couple of them for it to kind of be, well, third time love at first sight, your journey from Missouri to San Diego was sort of fairly quick after that?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it was probably 3 or 4 more years in the college town that I was living in, and then off to San Diego for sure. That was an interesting nexus of years. I mean, everybody I knew was kind of going more the traditional path, and it was always obvious that wasn't going to be a path for me, but the pressure really started to build about, okay, dude, well, what does that mean? How are you going to make something happen out of that? And just scary time all around.
So I asked you this at the wedding, but we're recording now. Why California? What got you in the automobile to head west?
Well, I did grow up more liberal in a conservative area, and I also have a love for Hollywood movies. I was a movie buff kid, so I just felt like California was, in one regard, a place where things happen for in the American system. I mean, I'm not going to go into the financial district of New York City, so I guess I should go to the entertainment hub and try to see what pops. And really, I could have done a podcast from anywhere. I didn't have to live in the most expensive city in the country to do that, right? And probably could have been better elsewhere. But I do think there is a creative energy here, some type of thing that I kind of needed to make it happen. But the real reason I moved here was to grow weed initially. Of course, that was legal. And at the time, it was one of the few places where you could do that. And after some unsuccessful attempts, I guess I shouldn't say unsuccessful because we grew weed and grew good weed. But when you have 8 pounds of weed, do you know somebody who can purchase 8 pounds of weed? Because if you don't, you're kind of just in trouble. That's a crucial piece of the making money off weed product process. I mean,
yeah.
So yeah, I turned into one of the only
business model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I turned into one of the only people who couldn't make money selling weed, but can from podcasting.
Yeah, but that journey itself. I mean, well, tell us about how the Higherside Chats ended up kind of what it was. Tell us the journey of the creation of the Higherside Chats.
Okay, well, at the time, as you know, there was really only Alex Jones, Coast to Coast, and Red Ice. Early in the internet, Red Ice was, I thought, what THC is now in a lot of ways. I mean, they were pretty great at pushing the envelope, and I actually have taken a lot of heat from Red Ice's progression because people write me and they say, I love what you're doing. I really want to support you, but I got burned so bad by Red Ice, and I don't know if I can support another person's journey to the alt-right. And of course, that would never happen. But the point is, at the time, I didn't think there was much filling what I wanted. I mean, I grew up fairly liberal, so these are shows that are fairly right-wing. And of course, liberal means something different now than it did when I grew up that I don't really associate with anymore. But none of these shows were embracing entheogenic culture. None of them were really youthful. None of them ever injected any type of humor about things. They're full of commercial breaks and all that kind of stuff. And I just felt like there was room for a different type of conspiracy show, I guess I would say.
And you initially wanted it, I mean, because it certainly has the personality of a show with some comedic DNA, but that was part of it, at least in the planning stage, wasn't it? You had some interest in an experience with comedy and thought maybe this can combine in some way.
Yeah, because at that time, the only path I could really think to try to work would be the comedy path. And that's a tough road to hoe, man. You really got to be doing it 10 years, making nothing before anybody knows your name. And I wasn't willing to do that. And when you're going to want to talk about such fringe material anyway, are you going to just make a living or build an audience catching people on Friday and Saturday night, 3 or 4 at a time and hoping they remember your name? It just doesn't really work anymore. It's an old, outdated model. So then I tried podcasting because I felt like it was just more something you can do from home, of course, something you can reach more people with. They can press play on demand. And yeah, it was all comedy at first. Local comedians here in San Diego, some guys up in that Joe Rogan crew Nexus. And it was fine, but I just felt like it wasn't all that special. I guess I would look at the episodes I was doing and say, yeah, you might get a few laughs out of here, but there's really not a ton of substance. And so I was like, let me go into another area that I love, which is that deep rabbit hole of conspiracy. And it was Michael Tsarion who was the first actual kind of more serious interview. And it just clicked at that point. I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. This is where I think there's room for me and what I'm going to be a little bit better at. And it just goes back to a lot of conspiracy people. The reason they get so frustrated is they look at the system and they say, how can I climb this? There's no way I can fucking climb this. It's so corrupt and it's just too massive and too epic in scale. So you got to find a ladder you can climb. And I guess I felt like podcasting and the conspiracy genre was one I could make my way near the top of. And depending on who you ask, I might have done all right.
Yeah, it's it's all right. It's doing okay. When did you realize it was? Like, when did you realize there's probably something in this for me? Like, this appears to have struck a chord with people, and I'm not just, firing off MP3s into the darkness.
I would probably say when Chris Jericho, the WWF or WWE as it's called now, wrestler, hit me up. And when I was a kid, I was really into wrestling. These are guys whose posters I had on my wall. So I get an email from Chris Jericho and he's like, I really want to do a conspiracy show, an episode of my podcast. And I really like the one you do. Would you come on and do an episode of mine? And that was really the first moment where I was like, okay, this is kind of crazy. Someone from a conventional, traditional path, traditional fame is hitting me up for something that they consider to be my wheelhouse and they need something from me. That is very strange. And I think that's happening for a lot of independent people right now because we are in the nexus of old media and new media. And people in the old media, I think, are trying to find ways onto the new ship. And so it's inevitable, but it felt very cool.
Yeah, that would be a fairly firm indication that you were getting cut through. But you mentioned that your interest in conspiracy obviously predates the Higherside Chats, right? So,
yeah.
What was your red pill conspiracy?
Well, it's cliche to say 9/11, but it just was because it was right in those coming of age years. You know, I think it was the first year of college or second year of college. And it was the first time that stuff became real because I had an interest in UFOs and aliens and the Loch Ness Monster all through childhood. And in fact, I guess one thing I could say that I really haven't ever said, because I don't know that it really adds all that much, is I did have a cryptid sighting when I was in about kindergarten age in the neighborhood my parents were having a house built in. There's a lot of undeveloped land still, and I saw something very strange, and I tried to get my parents over to see it with me, and they just thought I was pranking them, so they weren't quick to get over to where I was until I started bawling, because I knew that I was going to be the only person to see this thing, and there's just no way to ever explain it to anybody. And yeah, that was something that obviously stuck with me quite a bit, but 9/11 was a big catalyst.
Yeah, let's go back to that, though. Was it like a Bigfoot? Was it Mothman? What, a lizard man? A dog-headed thing? What did you see?
So that's the other thing that gets difficult about it is I've done a lot of cryptid shows, talked to a lot of the head guys, and no one has ever described what I saw. But, I'm looking down in this undeveloped field, and I see some humanoid shape, and it definitely looked at me immediately and had a recognition that I was looking at it. And all I can say is really what I said to my parents, who were, like a couple lots over looking at something else. And I say, Mom, Dad, come here. There's some weird bear thing down here. And, my parents know that there's not a bear in Arnold, Missouri. So they just kind of laugh it off. And then it goes from 4 legs to 2. It kind of stands up on 2 legs, on its hind legs. And it had an element of shape shifting because I said, wait a minute, wait. It's not a bear. And this is strange, but I said, it's a weird rhinoceros. And that is what I said to my parents. And it wasn't so much that it had 2 horns on its face as it was the texture of skin like a rhino or an elephant, that gray, dry skin. That's what it looked like, but with more the shape of a bear. It was really morphing. And then at that point, it basically stood on its back 2 legs, took 4 or 5 large lunging steps and was gone. It wasn't necessarily out of view. I don't know if it dematerialized, but it was gone. And I was in complete tears, breaking down. And my parents knew at that point that I did see something. I wasn't pulling their leg. And I made my parents go door to door in that cul-de-sac and ask every homeowner if they've ever seen anything weird behind their house. And of course, they all said no. And I don't know what I would describe it as. Maybe a skinwalker. They talk about those Native American half animal shapeshifters. And I don't know. That could be maybe the closest thing I could think of. There's also the idea people talk about your consciousness trying to fill in the gap when you're looking at something unknown and trying to roll through the Rolodex of what is this thing. And maybe that's what my brain was doing. But it was strange.
And how far away from you was it?
How far away? Maybe a basketball court.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think skinwalk is a good placeholder term for it because obviously there's a reason the cave art around the world is such a sort of dizzying zoomorphic array because whatever these things are, if you can even put them in a single class, our mind struggles to get its little hands around them. So that's cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was cool, but it is just bittersweet because it's something that if I could show a picture to someone or point to something cliche like a Bigfoot and say, that's what I saw, it would be way easier. Or if my parents would have just listened to my ass and gotten over there and put their eyes on this thing, then I wouldn't be just on my own island over here.
Well, that's kind of the reality of the phenomena, though, isn't it? So it's
right. It wasn't for them.
Yeah, exactly, and it's sort of baked into it, whether it's UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever, that it's a really profound experience for someone, and they end up sounding like lunatics. I'm sure it would have vanished if your parents started coming over.
Right. That makes sense. I agree.
Well, so it was 9/11 for you as the proverbial beginning conspiracy.
On the conspiracy side of things, yeah. And the other thing that was weird about that is I was in a room of good friends, and it was one buddy comes up and he brings up this movie Loose Change, the conspiracy documentary, Conspiracy Opinion of 9/11. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting as he's telling the story. And the room is completely divided between a few people who are inquisitive and want to know more and aren't really surprised that the government would be involved. And the other half of the room, guys I've known since kindergarten, got so emotional and worked up and refused to watch the documentary, refused to engage in conversation with it, thought the whole idea was ridiculous. And up to that point, I thought we were all pretty open-minded people who really couldn't be offended, loved telling like really provocative and offensive jokes and stories. And I just was really surprised to see them turn on a dime when it came to a conspiracy opinion like that. And that was another moment where I thought, I guess I am just different from other people because I have a different reaction that doesn't seem to be the norm.
Well, that is probably an experience you have more familiarity with now, years into the program, which is there are a lot of people who generally can't handle the existential horror, and it's where a lot of that stuff hides. If we're talking about kind of shameful or cliched wake-up experiences, something David Icke, of all people, said, which stuck with me, was one of the easiest ways they hide this is because you're not a psychopath, right? You can't actually think like them. But we're in 2017 now, so here's a question for that harkens back to having loose change divide the room. How is the status of your, chosen profession changed among your friends and family compared to when you first started out? Have some of those people crossed the line? Are they now increasingly aware that there may be something to your questing?
It is an interesting question, and I think about that quite a bit, but success breeds acceptance. And so when you have a little success, obviously people aren't going to be quite as critical to my face about it. And I wonder what they say behind my back. But a lot of people are just like, hey, man, I'm really happy that it worked out for you. And we don't really get into the details of exactly what I get into on the show all that much, except I do have some key friends who have decided to check it out and stick with it. And then I found out, as you know, at the wedding, that some of them have had lifelong strange experiences that would lead them to be more open to the show that I do. And that's a bonding thing with people you've known for a long time, too. But I would say they're more open to it. My parents were always kind of like, just go do you, and that's obviously very helpful because people who don't have those kind of parents can spend years dealing with that trauma. And so I would say they're pretty open to it. And friends, they're just happy that I am not homeless, but they probably aren't so in love with what I'm doing. One thing that is interesting is around the Pizzagate days, not that long ago, but when that one guy went into Comet Pizza with the gun, everybody knows that story. That is when I did start to sense that some people in my circle, in my conventional life circle, started to think that I might have some responsibility as to like what I'm putting on the air because I might be causing people to do things that are unsafe, or I might be part of the problem. And to me, that was exactly what that story was supposed to do, is to make people who are investigating a conspiracy seem scary and dangerous, that it's actually wrong to do. It's not just loony like it used to be, but now you're actually emboldening people who are unhinged to go into places with guns. And I don't know how you make that leap necessarily, but it is something I've noticed at that point, and I'm thinking that it's probably going to come up again eventually.
Well, we get into the meat of it, because one of these questions is for the first half of 2017 at least, and the back end of 2016, the so-called alternative media has given the President of the United States the kind of easy ride that Obama would get from the likes of the New York Times.
True.
So that I find very suspicious. And it's another factor in what you're talking about, which is there appears to have been, or is, an increasing interest in what was previously, the lunatic fringe. What do you think of this development, and why do you think that is the case?
You're right. There is a little bit of an added interest, and I think it's probably internet culture. I think the internet started off as a Wild West type situation, very uncensored. People are looking at things that you never had access to on websites like rotten.com and strange forum boards. And I don't know, maybe out of that grew an appreciation for conspiracy. It's definitely part of the internet. You can go to most comedy clubs on a Friday night and hear someone tell a joke about going down a deep conspiracy rabbit hole on YouTube, because that is now something that a lot of people can identify with. It's like, something that didn't exist before. And I think probably opening up those channels of media has just made people very curious, and probably curious about things they didn't even know they were curious about, because it just wasn't on the table in the early 90s and before.
So you don't think there's something more deliberate about it? The fact that the president-elect went on Alex Jones and so on? You don't think this is... Yeah.
Oh, yeah. In that case, absolutely. I definitely do. And I think there's something to be said about just various nets that scoop people up. And the past election definitely scooped up a good amount of conspiracy folks in a net where, you're right, they are now supporting the president in a weird way. And it's like, this is the empire. This is what you're supposed to be against. And it is odd that there's a lot of apologists out there now. And just, I don't necessarily know what to make of it, except when you tie in Alex Jones, of course, that seems fairly easy to parse out that I guess he's just trying to capitalize on the alternative. I mean, I guess compare it to Hillary Clinton, which was just so mainstream. I don't know how they pulled off pushing him as an outsider when he's been part of the system as long as he's been alive. He's got family ties to the deep state and John G. Trump, the guy who actually was the one to assess Tesla's papers and say there's nothing to see here, nothing of value. He was consulting Vannevar Bush on his thesis, and this is Trump's first uncle. And I don't know, he just seems as connected as ever, but I don't know why people got caught up in this trap and saw him as an outsider, someone who's exploited his workers on every project of his career for decades. All of a sudden, he's going to turn around and care about you?
Well, I mean, he's also friends with the Clintons, and Chelsea and Ivanka are very good friends.
Right.
So this is my point. Like, there's kind of been, and admittedly, it was always an uneasy alliance, because you did mention Red Ice before it sort of went the way it did. It's always been an uneasy alliance on the fringe between some groups, some of which are really gross. And so the election has kind of pulled the tide out, and you see people swimming naked differently. You see people in the alternative world who turn out to just be apologists for Clintonism and think being a Democrat is somehow the answer. And so they're ruined. And then you have this giant chunk of people defending a billionaire reality star as the people's champion against the deep state. And that is suspicious.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I got caught up in the trap of thinking that Obama was going to be some kind of real hope and change in that first election, but he didn't have the background and the track record that Trump does. So I don't really know how they pulled it off. I can't imagine the same people feeling similarly about George W. Bush, but here we have just another conservative, political leader, and they eat it up. And I guess it was really because Alex Jones endorsed it. And that's strange that he would do it. Year after year, it's always about fighting the empire. And then all of a sudden, we got our guy in. And it's like, how did you pull that off? How did you really convince people that was true? I mean, everybody was surprised by the election results. I definitely was. We talked about that. I mean, you weren't, surprised. I guess. No. Yeah. You were the only one, honestly, who was telling me that Clinton wasn't going to win. And I thought it was just going to be the same predictable pattern as we've seen before. But I guess in a way it really is. It's just a different name on the ticket.
That's going to be my next question. So even though maybe it's my own failing, but the corner of discourse that I expected to be the sort of champion of, well, let's look at this differently, has descended into either everyone I don't like is a Nazi or this billionaire reality star is here to save us from the deep state. So the question becomes, just to your point there, is the same group still in charge, Greg?
If I had to put my money on it, I would say, yeah, probably. I don't think much has changed at all. I mean, I think you're a way better geopolitical analyst than I am, but I assume you'd probably agree that not a whole ton has changed.
I don't think Donald Trump is in a war for freedom against the deep state. No, I don't think that is. I don't think that is the best interpretation of his existence or behavior. Yeah, I think there's probably a downsizing of the management layer, and I don't think they like that. So I think we saw that with Brexit and the inevitable end of the EU and so on. I think that fulfillment layer is being downsized, but that's a top-down change rather than the good guys are coming in to fight the deep state. And I think framing it in that narrative falls into the trap where, as we're about to see, you have, popular media clamoring for some fairly dramatic changes to some already American civil liberties and freedom is bloodied and on life support since the Patriot Act anyway, and we're about to start seeing people asking for yet more restrictions on it, and it's because and that looks like it's a policy change from the same group rather than some kind of exciting battle between the good guys and the bad guys.
Right. And, that's the next thing that's kind of worrying me is we already are facing a situation where you're seeing a lot of alternative voices get silenced by having their AdSense rug pulled out from out under them or having Google results, altered search results. They're going to be on page 2 or 3 rather than at the top of page 1. And now I'm a little worried about these corporate payment processors because we've talked about the move going to a cashless society. And if you've got Google Pay and Android Pay, I mean, these kind of, in a way, become your bosses. And if you don't align with their morals, if you don't align with their corporate structure, then they can just shut off your income. And that's basically a boss, And that's kind of my next worry is all the clamps seem to be like getting tighter on the alternative. And I do think they are going to choke out voices with these corporate payment processors if you adopt them. It's a little bit concerning. Patreon is obviously the next thing everybody loves, and it seems independent, but let's see what it looks like in 5 years.
Well, it won't even be 5 years. Patreon will do what Etsy does and just delist people that it changes its terms and conditions and delists you. So that will be the next one. Well, we've had this discussion because going back to the election, actually for me, it was a little bit before because when I had a proper job, I was in the room at Google when they said to European publishers that we will shape the bid depth on YouTube because these, newspapers in Turkey and Germany were saying, we have no money. This is it. It's over. And they said, well, actually, we have half a billion euros for teaching you how to do internet journalism, and we will shape the bids on YouTube videos so your videos get more popular ones. And then I had Catherine Fitz quote my book opening her Q2 report last year, and within 2 days I had a European data privacy takedown of a couple of my posts, and they were the ones that mentioned Clinton's kill count. So obviously Catherine still has powerful people listening to her. And then through the election, this happened to both of us, but you more, you got shadow banned on Twitter, and any of the Clinton stuff, well, not any of it, but a few very choice things to do with Clinton and Haiti that I would share on the Facebook page. And I know how many people on average view it. It got like 7 views. And this is interesting. So we're seeing, I think, a pivot, which I saw coming, and people thought I was paranoid, and now it's happening. I think a lot of what's going on in the 98% managed fight the Nazis, Antifa are bad discourse that's going on, I think a lot of that is heading towards these increased control mechanisms. Because now that Antifa, for instance, is officially domestic terrorists according to the FBI, that's how you can get a T&C change with Patreon and the likes and go, right, well, you're done and you're done and you're done. And this is why I think it's the same group in charge. I think it's part of that. It's like the final build out of a global, speaking of Catherine Fitz, free-range totalitarianism.
It really is. And it's the same old playbook, because labeling has been used since the dawn of time. I mean, that is how you dehumanize people and allow the system to abuse them the way it wants to. I mean, whether you call people communists and then they can no longer make movies anymore, or Nazis and now it's okay to punch them, or, you know, call conspiracy people terrorists or dangerous. It's like the same old thing. And it is just kind of sad to see people falling into that again. Like, I grew up identifying as a liberal because I thought that was the party of free, open tolerance. I thought that was the anti-violence, anti-empire, anti-war, anti-drug war, pro-exotic energy solutions, and anti-censorship party. You know, that's not necessarily party, because it wasn't a left-right thing. You know, it wasn't a traditional political party situation, but I definitely was left-leaning for all those reasons. And now it's just morphed into something that I definitely don't identify with. Maybe it's just the times and the way you've always said people start acting crazy as the ship is sinking, but it's definitely gone off the rails.
I think there's also a case to be made for some just classic conspiracy 101 here. Like, you have from the early 20th century, and it's lessons learned from the British Empire, stated policies of working out how you manage people's opinions and social control. And you have like groups founded by, you know, elite families that spend millions investigating this. And you have Brzezinski doctrines about, you know, controlling both sides of the dialectic. Like, they publish this in books. And I think there's a case to be made to kind of get to a pure conspiracy 101, which is they spent 100 years and unlimited amounts of money working out the best way to manage a dialectic, and here we are in a managed dialectic. And can you maybe think that those two are connected?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, man. And another Jordan Peterson thing I love that he says is the cultivated individual is the hero of our time. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you can't identify with these groups. And if you cultivate your individuality, that's the hardest thing to manipulate. I mean, you know, you can fund any think tanks you want, but you got to rope people into groups. You got to catch them in nets like the Trump net or something. And if people do cultivate their individuality, I think that's the best armor you can put on against this kind of manipulation.
I think it's the only one. I think it's the only front in the mind war, and it always has been. You find the kind of great teachers throughout history, you know, Jesus and Buddha quite literally saying that, you know, that this is the sort of apocalyptic battle is at the very edge of yourself. It's not in some kind of third act Lord of the Rings fight.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that's happening in the conspiracy world that is a bit of a problem is I'm very used to being the most radical. And at this point, we have this flat Earth resurgence, and I'm no longer feeling like the most radical. You know, when I started the show, it would be like the depth of every rabbit hole. Sure, we can go there. It's not going to bother me whatsoever. But now there's a growing segment of people who think the Earth is flat and think the lie is that big. And I don't think that. And I'm starting to feel like more like a centrist in the conspiracy world. And that's just an odd place to be.
You don't think that's a natural emergence, though, do you? You think, I would speculate, and reasonably so, that it's part of that wider hit. It's on the same spectrum of operations that's going to manage the discourse or sort of swoop the net, to use your metaphor, as what we've seen with all of these people who were previously anti-state falling in behind a reality TV star president.
Right. And it really is anything that comes from one person out of nowhere overnight is something you always got to be skeptical of. And it all came from this Eric Dubay guy who lived in Thailand and just started putting out all these documentaries. And it's like, who is this guy? Why, out of the billions of things posted, is he rising to the top of Google algorithms? Like, what the hell is going on? So it does seem like in an era where there are people in control of the levers, he was definitely elevated faster than almost anybody, especially in the conspiracy world. So you got to be suspicious of that.
Do you think that's, I mean, I'll give you my contention as to what it is, and we'll talk about it. Do you think that's because it's become more and more difficult to hide the sort of onboarding of the breakaways and the secret space program, with so much of the stuff, so much of the videos and images and evidence we have for space being clearly doctored, which isn't to say space isn't real, it's to say that the lie is fraying around the edges. Do you think this was sort of like an advance action to ruin the discourse around people going, well, wait a minute, you're not telling us everything about space?
Right. Probably like a muddy the waters approach. People start waking up to some NASA lies, so you have to really throw some squid ink in the water and say, well, actually, it's because the Earth is flat. Like, obviously, that's not the conclusion that you probably should come to in the end when you dissect that stuff. But this is Brzezinski doctrine, like up and down. This is exactly how you manage a dialectic. Right.
And in fact, it was one of an Obama staffer saying that they were going to do that by having people mention the Jews in any of these kind of discourses around 9/11. So it had previously been the Jews that ruins it. Like, so everyone, and there's a famous, well, not famous, I find hilarious Onion article where it says conspiracy theory going really well until that bit about the Jews. And I think flat Earth is that, when people start to realize, as private space programs and so on come online publicly and are listed on the New York Stock Exchange and so on, people sort of look up and go, I don't think, based on what they're saying, the story you've told is correct. And into that attempted exploration comes this wave of actually the Earth is flat, and it turns people off and it makes you look ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. But the problem is I guess I don't really understand. Obviously, we can see fakery, but it is hard for me to put a motive on that outside of the flat Earth paradigm. It's really kind of difficult for me to. I mean, I guess are they just trying to say they can do things they can't do? I mean, are they trying to? I think it's the
opposite. I think it's the opposite. I mean, are we multiplanetary, Greg? What do you think?
Well, Gary McKinnon would say there's some space platforms out there with military astronauts on them.
So did Reagan. Man. He wrote it in his diary.
Right.
He said that we've got 150 people up in space. What an age we live in. And this is in the 80s. So are we multiplanetary? And as a result, is the kind of International Space Station, for instance,
limited hangout?
Yeah, pretty much. And I think that's, funnily enough, here's my contention, because I'm going to turn this into a question, right? No, I'll do the question first. The CIA is now in the food business in the US and is undercutting other food retailers by 47%. Now, what that will mean for Whole Foods / Amazon shares, and when you have unlimited money behind you, you can sell food at a loss and burn out the rest of the industry, which appears to be what they're doing. So the CIA is in the food business, and within several years will be the source of the majority of food for Americans. And so we have this. And we have a closing down and an opt-in. We will clamor for increased digital surveillance on the internet because of this managed dialectic. So you will have an ID that the CIA will be aware of, that will be associated with things you purchase and things you do and so on. This, to me, looks like the onboarding of that kind of, much like the iPhone, you don't notice when breakaway technology onboards. And I think this is part of that same move, and it's somehow associated with Trump. But what's the end game with the CIA getting into the food business and burning out the rest of the industry, Greg?
Man, I mean, that is a question I've been wondering myself, man. That's $1 million question. It's hard to say exactly what their motivations are, because there's so many companies in the food space doing what you would think the agenda would be doing, which is, devoiding things of nutrients and maximizing profits. And I mean, they're basically controlling a lot of that stuff and taking the power away from the people to take care of themselves. And that's done. So I don't know that I mean, obviously you see that there's a new player coming in and making themselves known, but what is Amazon and the CIA? What is this process going to do differently that Monsanto's not already doing?
Well,
it's hard to say.
Well, I don't know if it is. Maybe it's easy. So, if you burn off the rest of the places that Americans can buy food as an alternative to Whole Foods, so that you become the majority food retailer, which, if you add Amazon sales, it is technically the largest retailer in the country now, right?
Right.
That means if I grow food, I have one place to sell it. And if I grow food and don't want to use Monsanto products, Whole Foods won't buy it. So you have a kind of retail opportunity to change it, because it got away from Monsanto. Like, they were in trouble last year. Everyone knows about Roundup. Everyone knows about glyphosate and knows that they're, a lying GMO manipulative demon organization. And so the other side of it, so that's the left hand, and then the right hand moves into the food industry and starts burning off its competitors. So I think that's what we're seeing now.
The same old centralized kind of system, the same market control that, you could apply the same thing that they did to books already. Now they're the biggest bookseller, so they can kind of control who's going to be popular and who's not. I guess they can do the same thing with food. Yeah, if you don't check all the boxes on the kind of food we want sold, good luck. Go find a market that isn't us.
Yeah, and all of your purchases will then be matched to your online behavior, and this is the kind of that's the free-range totalitarianism that Catherine Fitz talks about. You won't be aware. You won't be aware that the fact that you're buying this cucumber is associated with the fact that you hit like on an Antifa tweet in May 2017, but
right.
It will be.
They're going to send me all the tainted apples, you're saying?
Well, no, I don't know what their end game is, other than the fact that it's a further and terrifying example of full spectrum dominance. Yeah. Because you now have, within several years, majority control over the American food supply, and as a result, you can dictate its terms.
Right. But I mean, you definitely can selectively poison people through that mechanism. Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Especially once you get into a digital currency and food stamp world, where, much like how China does with WeChat, or at least WeChat does, but it's a Chinese policy, your online behavior, your capacity to have a digital currency will be contingent on your digital compliance. So that's the bit. This is where they're moving. This is the free-range totalitarianism. And Trump is for whatever reason, and I think it's a downsizing, because once you have free-range totalitarianism, that management layer, which is the EU and the Clintons and all that kind of stuff, is unnecessary. Because it's very easy to, it's how G7 can control a planet of 10 billion people. You can't do it with an empire. It's too expensive. So this is the thing. And it's also why it comes back to what you do needs to be on an individual basis, which is literally what Jesus said, right? And that means food sovereignty, I think, has become a bit more urgent, because look at where the other clampdowns are happening.
Absolutely. And I think that was one of the best things about our last talk, is talking about mitigating risk and your exposure to these things by preparing now. Fight big agri by growing your own food and sourcing your meat. Fight big pharma by practicing better general health, exercise, intermittent fasting, cannabis oil, whatever it is. You can insulate yourself a little bit. Do it better. It's going to be a lot better for you to learn how to garden than it is to hold a poster in a crowd, right?
Yeah, 100%. So let's see if we can't find other bits that might work with this. And this is a question I was looking forward to asking. Greg, what's going on in Antarctica?
Oh, well, clearly they unearthed something. I mean, if you listen to Joseph Farrell, of course, or Walter Bosley, they both talk about interesting aspects of that. But apparently the UFO, I've seen multiple UFO stories and photos, but it all seems to be kind of too over the top for me. But I guess probably something in that wheelhouse of ancient antiquities, I would guess, if I had to say something. I think that with the changing climate and the melting ice caps, I mean, there's a good chance, like we've said before, both you and I have said, that where else are you going to look for something ancient, some kind of old technology or some kind of hidden knowledge on some old tablets. I mean, that's really the place that you're probably going to find something. And we've seen all the crazy high-level elite people who have gone there in the past couple of years. They're obviously on a tour looking at something interesting that's there. I assume it has to do with the ancient world. I mean, that's probably the best guess.
So you don't think it has, because I know you're a bit partial to some Hollow Earth theory. You don't think, is Hollow Earth theory a misinterpretation of this, or is that a partial interpretation of Hollow Earth theory? Do you know what I mean? Because it's interesting that it's the poles again, right?
Right.
And in particular the southern one. And it has the same kind of challenges. You've had guests on before talking about the low resolution maps you get of the polar regions, which is, I mean, I was listening to that and I found that absurd because I had clients in London who are satellite businesses who sell maps to, companies that need maps, and they can get down to like reading your newspaper, but it's anything below 200 feet is US national security, so they can't sell it. But it does mean the entire world is high definition mapped, and there are bits missing. So do you think one is related to the other, or are they misinterpretations of each other? What do you think?
Well, obviously that's the smoke that would suggest there's some kind of fire here, and it would be awesome. It would make my day if it was something to do with the inner Earth. I don't know. That's not the story that a lot of these people are coming up with, though. A lot of the people who are on this thing seem to be leaning more towards some type of object from the past. But if it was some geographical hole, I mean, I would love that, or some kind of pathway in. But I'm not hearing a lot of people discuss that kind of thing. I mean, obviously, we're only hearing whispers anyway, and much of it is speculation. But it would be great if that's what it was.
Yeah, I'm sure inevitably the answer is weird, because much like why I'm interested in your interest in Hollow Earth theory is it is a solve. It's that data and interpretation thing, right? It's a solve for the fact that if you haven't looked into how planets are supposed to form, and specifically ours and our moon, you don't realize that actually it's a falsified guess is the stuff you kind of were told one morning in geology class in high school. It's like, oh, and this happened, and it's not correct. And I think into that gap, and it's potentially, and this is coming towards the last question, the whole sort of point of conspiracy yoga, into that gap is this sort of analysis, and it's kind of useful as a solvent to sort of break down ossified thought forms that are wrong, and because it's the planetary formation is an open question.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I have had some people come out and say, oh, I think the flat Earth psyop is to distract from the hollow Earth, and I'm sure that's tongue-in-cheek, because it's not like a lot of people were on to the hollow Earth all of a sudden, so it needed some big distraction. But we know other bodies are hollow. We crashed that thing into the moon and it rang like a bell. They say Phobos is hollow. Of course, this is taking NASA's word for things again, which is a slippery slope. But
well, you got the Soviets with Phobos as well, so I think we can say that Phobos is hollow because the Soviets said it too.
Well, let's say it. But,
yeah.
That one thing that is good about the flat Earth is that it has got a lot of people looking at Antarctica, because if in their paradigm, if it's an ice wall around the outer ring of the bullseye, then you should be able to prove it by looking at this place other than any other place on the planet. So I like that about it, because I do want to get down there and see some stuff. But yeah, it's just super suspicious, and it fuels the speculation that it is so closed off, and there is so much censorship over it. I hope it's a hole.
It's in a weird way, you can defend the case that flat Earth is a psyop to cover Hollow Earth, because it's all the one enchilada, right? So if it is vastly ancient alien ruins in Antarctica, it changes the nature, or it changes the prehistory of our solar system one way or the other. So and it gives us, like, we're potentially a terraformed planet at that point, which seems likely to me anyway. Mm-hmm. So it in a funny way, even though the hollow Earth thing may not be correct, it's sort of true. Like, flat Earth is there as air cover because whatever's going on in Antarctica is important ontologically for the story of Earth and the story of the solar system.
Well, that's another good point about why it might be something geographical, because why wouldn't they just move it? You know, if they could, why would they take Buzz Aldrin and the Russian patriarch to Antarctica if you could bring whatever is there to some other undisclosed location that's, you know, not so cold?
Yeah, I think my guess would be, and it's sort of based on the stuff, as you just mentioned, Walter Bosley spoke about, my guess would be it is large, ancient industrial ruins, and they may well be the remnants of terraforming, for instance, but if not, I don't think they're things you can move. Alternatively, it's kind of like, you know how Elon Musk says we should bomb the poles of Mars to terraform it. It may be a crater. It may be a radioactive crater. Right.
Ground zero for panspermia.
Something like that.
That would be super interesting, too. That seems a little harder to identify in a visual way in 2017. Not impossible, but harder than if it was a megalithic structure or some type of carved stone or some type of opening.
Yeah, obviously I want it to be like Lovecraftian giant stone city stuff, but
Cthulhu on ice.
Pretty much, and I think I think we'll both be disappointed, but whatever it is, it's weird.
Absolutely. And it makes you think a little bit more about the Admiral Byrd stuff, because apparently he was funded by the Rockefellers and he was a Mason, and these are things I can't verify, but there's a lot of people who say them, and it gets to be like, well, why would these powers be behind the Admiral Byrd story? Is it because they're investigating things on the DL that they don't want the other people to know about? Or is it because it's a whole psyop in itself? It could be one or the other, but I think that they're probably doing areas of research. If you look at what they've done with crop circles and other areas, they seem to have an interest in alternative things without trying to disclose it publicly.
Yeah, which maybe brings us to the lucky last question, which is, what's the point? What's the point of all this? Honestly, why? I was about to say, why do we do it? And we both do, but why do you do this? What's the point?
Well, when I was younger, I just wanted to get a better sense of the world. And I used to have that attitude that a lot of people still have of, it's not working for me, so burn it all down. There's a lot of people out there that are cheerleaders for the collapse. And that's just a dangerous attitude. It actually isn't much different than the elite's attitude, which is, I don't care who suffers. This is what I want for me. Because everyone would suffer very greatly if the system collapsed. So to cheer for that because you can't find your place in it is fucked up. I mean, yeah, it's unfair. And I think the value in this is to, get a better sense of the landscape and figure out how to navigate it and figure out how to find success for yourself despite all that stuff. And that should be kind of a badge of honor to acknowledge that you were put through a school system that was built from the ground up to keep you down. You've been drinking soda your whole life and doing all these things that are completely shooting yourself in the foot, and you had no idea. And then despite all this, despite being in debt from college or being stuck in some job you can't stand, you found a way to navigate, or at least in our cases we have. And I think that's the value of it, is to learn that the traditional path, the white picket fence thing that they're selling you, is not real, especially not now. And so you got to find something different. And if I had my head in the sand, I could have gone an ignorance is bliss route and just been a happy little store manager forever. I mean, I know people who are living that life, and that's why they say ignorance is bliss, because when you wake up to that and knowing you need to do something different, that's stressful. That's hard to know you have to do it yourself. But I would say the value in it is just having a more honest worldview, if you can, parse out what's true in this crazy world.
Well, that's a noble goal. I think I share that, which is to find a map that is, to paraphrase Terence McKenna, to find the least imprisoning map possible because this stuff is real, and as we can just see, like the CIA is making a successful play for the American food supply. Like if you don't, you need to have a map of that going on. So you need to be able to conceptualize that, and you need to have a response to it. Or how do you live in a world where the CIA is making a play for the US food supply? And so this is the sort of secondary question to that. So how do people, best navigate the conspiracy in their own little boats without being swamped? Are there tips to wading into these waters that are murky because they're filled with spies, but also lunatics and idiots and others? Like, what are some tips for navigating the conspiracy?
I love that, the conspiracy. And this is much like the last question I asked you last time, which is, what would you tape up on the mirror for people to remind themselves of in these crazy times? And you had said, be humble. And I do think that's really what you got to do is don't get too obsessed with any one thing. I mean, how many times have I gotten an email from someone who saw one guy's 4 hours of research and now has all the answers figured out, and they don't have to do any more research, and this is it. And if I'm not doing shows about this, then I'm a shill. I mean, I would say don't get too obsessed with anything that is really outside of your sphere that you can really verify. Do your meta-analysis, to use your terms, get a bird's eye view of things without getting too obsessed with particular details that really can't be verified. It is tough to navigate things. And I guess it just depends on, what your goals are, but definitely try to mitigate your risk and exposure to the empire. If you have gotten to age 30 without crippling college debt, then you're already in the top third. That's when someone has 50 grand in debt, 60 grand in debt, and they're in an industry that is dying and is going to be replaced by robots. I mean, what do you tell them? What do you tell them? Where is the hope? Should they even look at this stuff online? Because, I mean, it seems once you're that deep in, it is really hard to pull it out. Debt is the control mechanism. If you're already in it, it's very hard to pivot anywhere else other than get that solved before apparently everything shifts over to China in 2032.
Yeah, well, we got to make it to 2032, I suppose. Well,
that's true. And we are at a time, like you've said, UFO sightings are at an all-time high. We just had this crazy eclipse. Apparently, there's a Chicago Mothman that there's a huge concentration of sightings right now. I think there's up to 40. And these are sightings like in downtown Chicago, like right along Lakeshore Drive. And those things are pretty interesting. So we are in strange times. I don't know why that's super relevant, but it is interesting that there's a paranormal element in play.
So by the time this episode comes out, I will have had an episode with Chris Knowles and Miguel Connor talking about our Gnostic age. These are the signs and portents of a Gnostic age. The world, when it turns, fills with UFOs and Mothmen and wizards and what have you. It's at least the fireworks are interesting.
Hey man, yeah, I agree. And I guess what else people should do? Get bulletproof, get invincible. Develop your invincibility through whatever means necessary. But I guess just don't get caught up in the nets. Don't get caught up in the everyone's a Nazi net. Don't get caught up in the Trump love net. Just cultivate that rugged individuality and be the hero of our time.
Now that is a tremendous last line to wind the show up on. So, Mr. Carlwood, in the unlikely event that people don't know where to go to find out more about your good self, where should they go to find out more about your good self?
Well, the place to be is the Highersidechats.com. And of course, I use that classic red ice model of having a subscription for a longer show, which is the HighersideChatsPlus.com.
I'm a proud Plus member of years, so that's definitely a promotion and a shout out for Plus membership. Carry on.
Very, very much appreciate that. And then the Higherside clothing is T-shirts with designs based off of the material in the shows. And the next one to release is actually from our conversation of the pig-chimp hybrid. It is a bunch of grays with a guy on a table stitching them together with pig parts. So it's all fun stuff. But I like the provocative nature of putting that really weird stuff on T-shirts and just seeing the reactions of people around you. You don't have to engage them, but you should get an internal chuckle by just the way some cashiers will look at you when you walk up with some of these T-shirts. But the Higherside Chats is basically my umbrella. Everything's under that.
And this, as well as Greg's prolific Twitter account, will be in the show notes.
Yep, at Higherside Chats. Dude, thanks so much for having me, man. I consider you a bit of a mentor, like an older brother mentor in a lot of ways. And so, I don't know how much value I have to add to a show that you host because you're more eloquent and educated on pretty much all subjects. But I do appreciate you having me on, man. It's a good time.
No, I was looking forward to it. You've cleared up some stuff for me as well. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. And I will no doubt talk to you soon.
Hell yeah, man. Cheers to succeeding in a rigged game.
Well, that was a lot of fun. Cryptids, Antarctica, managed dialectics, and just generally sailing the conspiracies. I coined that portmanteau deliberately, extending the metaphor. It is a return to the notion of maps and terrain. If you set sail with, just the one that came with the ship rental, I can all but guarantee you'll end up on the rocks or press-ganged by pirates. Draw your own map, draw it dispassionately, draw it in pencil, and always keep it with you. Speaking of things to keep with you, apparently you can get podcasts on smartphones. So be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcatcher, get in touch via the RuneSoup Facebook page, and or find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.